Good evening and welcome. Tonight, we turn our attention to the quiet and unresolved disappearance of Marion Barter, an Australian schoolteacher who vanished while travelling overseas in 1997. Marion was a respected and experienced educator from Queensland. She had spent many years working with children and families, and she was known among colleagues as thoughtful, dependable, and deeply committed to her profession. In the months leading up to her departure, there was nothing publicly known to suggest that she was in distress or planning to disappear. Her journey was intended to be a period of travel and personal time, something she had looked forward to, and it followed a path that many travellers choose, moving gradually through Europe. What makes this case quietly unsettling is not only that Marion did not return home, but that she did not simply vanish without trace. There were letters, phone calls, and official records that confirmed movement and activity for a period of time after she left Australia. And then, without warning, those traces slowly stopped. The disappearance of an adult who has chosen to travel can be difficult to define. People move between countries, change accommodation, and follow new routines, and silence can initially appear ordinary. In Marion's case, however, the silence did not resolve into clarity. It became the beginning of a long and carefully examined investigation, shaped not by a single moment of crisis, but by a growing pattern of unanswered questions. This is not a story of sudden violence or public tragedy. It is a story of distance, of separation, and of a life that quietly drifted beyond contact. While official records and financial systems continued to register traces of movement connected to a person who was no longer in touch with anyone who knew her, only information that has been confirmed through official investigation and judicial review will be presented as fact in this episode. Where claims exist that have not been formally established, they will be described clearly and gently as unproven. There will be no graphic detail and no speculation presented as truth. Marion Barter's case has been examined in Australia through formal police investigation, and later through significant public and legal review. Over time, it has become one of the country's most closely studied long-term missing person cases, not because of mystery alone, but because of the unusual combination of documentation, international travel records, and ongoing activity connected to a person who was no longer in contact with family or friends. At its center is a single, quiet question. What happened to a woman who left home to travel, stayed in touch for a time, and then slowly disappeared from the lives of those who were waiting for her return? Tonight's story follows only what can be confirmed. It follows the journey that was planned, the journey that took place, and the moment when contact ended. It does not attempt to fill the silence with answers that cannot be supported. As you listen, the pace will remain gentle and unhurried. You do not need to hold every detail closely. This is simply a quiet account of a disappearance that has remained unresolved for more than 2 decades. And so, as the night settles around you, we begin with a teacher from Queensland, a planned journey overseas, and the long and unanswered absence of Marion Barter, before her disappearance became a national concern. Marion Barter was known simply as a long-serving and respected schoolteacher in Queensland. For many years, her life followed a steady and familiar rhythm shaped by the school calendar, classroom routines, and the quiet responsibilities that come with working closely with children and families. Colleagues later described her as reliable, organized, and deeply committed to her role as an educator. Marion had spent much of her adult life working within the Queensland education system. Teaching was not a temporary job or a short chapter in her life. It was a career that had defined her daily structure, her professional identity, and her connection to the community around her. There is no public record of disciplinary issues, professional disputes, or workplace conflicts connected to her role, and police have never indicated that her employment placed her in any form of known risk. Outside of work, Marion lived a private and largely self-contained life. She was a single parent to her daughter, and had spent many years balancing family responsibilities alongside her teaching career. Friends and family later explained that she valued independence and personal space, and that she was thoughtful rather than impulsive in the way she approached major decisions. In the period leading up to her departure from Australia, there were no confirmed reports that Marion was experiencing personal crisis. Police later stated that there was no evidence of domestic conflict, financial distress, or legal difficulty that might have suggested a sudden or urgent need to leave the country. Her plans to travel were not presented as a reaction to hardship, but as a deliberate and considered decision. For some time, Marion had spoken about wanting to take an extended break from teaching and to spend time overseas. This was not described as a permanent move, but as a period of travel and personal exploration. Family members later confirmed that the idea of traveling through Europe had been discussed well before her departure. Her journey was planned openly. There was no attempt to conceal her travel arrangements, and there is no indication that she attempted to separate her plans from those closest to her. She organized leave from work and made practical preparations consistent with a temporary absence, rather than a permanent departure. Marion's teaching position and professional responsibilities were addressed in advance, and her departure was not abrupt. This is an important detail in understanding how her disappearance was later interpreted by investigators. From an official perspective, her decision to travel appeared structured and orderly, not rushed or reactive. Police have also confirmed that there were no unusual financial withdrawals, asset transfers, or legal changes made in the period immediately before she left Queensland. Her personal affairs remained largely consistent with someone intending to return home after a period away. For Marion, the journey represented a change in pace rather than a change in identity. She was stepping away from daily classroom life, not from her role as a parent, a professional, or a member of her community. Family later described her departure as emotionally significant, but not alarming. At the time, international travel was not uncommon for Australian teachers taking extended leave. Many used the opportunity to visit family overseas, explore new countries, or simply rest after long years of professional responsibility. Marion's plan fit comfortably within this pattern. There was also no indication that Marion intended to cut off communication with her family. In fact, her early travel period would later confirm the opposite. She remained in contact, sent letters and made phone calls, and shared details of her experiences. This matters because it shapes the way her disappearance must be understood. The decision to leave Queensland was not secretive. It was not hidden. It was a planned and openly communicated transition into a period of travel. The quiet stability of Marion's life in Queensland stands in contrast to the uncertainty that followed. Her days were defined by routine, classrooms, school administration, and family responsibilities. Nothing in the publicly confirmed record suggests that she was attempting to escape a dangerous situation or sever ties with her past. For investigators, this background became one of the most difficult elements of the case. There was no obvious emotional, professional, or practical pressure pointing toward disappearance. There was no documented conflict that could be connected to her decision to leave. Instead, the starting point of this story remains calm and ordinary. A long-serving teacher chose to take time away from work. A mother prepared for a period of travel. A journey was planned in a way that appeared thoughtful and consistent with the life she had built. It is from this steady and unremarkable foundation in Queensland that Marion Barter began the trip from which she would never be confirmed to return. When Marion Barter left Australia in 1997, her departure was recorded in the same routine way as thousands of other international travellers. Airline and immigration records later confirmed that she travelled under her own name and with a valid Australian passport. There is no indication that her departure involved any irregular documentation, false identity, or unusual travel arrangements. Police later confirmed that Marion departed from Australia in June of that year. Her travel plans had been shared with family, and her intention to spend time overseas was known in advance. At the time of her departure, there were no reports of concern raised by airline staff, border officials, or anyone connected to her journey. The early phase of her travel can be traced through official records and through her own communication with family. These two sources, taken together, formed the most reliable picture of where Marion went during the first part of her time overseas. According to confirmed travel records, Marion arrived in the United Kingdom shortly after leaving Australia. This was consistent with the itinerary she had discussed with family before departing. The United Kingdom was not intended to be her final destination, but rather the starting point for a broader period of travel across Europe. In the days and weeks following her arrival, Marion remained in contact with her daughter and other family members. These early communications were later described by family as calm, positive, and consistent with someone enjoying a long-awaited break from work. There were no expressions of fear, distress, or uncertainty reported in these contacts. Police later confirmed that letters sent by Marion during this early period were postmarked from the United Kingdom. The contents of these letters have not been released in full, but authorities stated that they reflected ordinary travel updates rather than requests for help or indications of difficulty. There were also confirmed telephone calls during this early stage of her trip. These calls were made using normal international calling arrangements, and nothing about the timing or content of the calls suggested urgency. From an investigative perspective, this confirmed that Marion was alive and actively traveling during this period. Financial records also supported this understanding. Bank activity linked to Marion showed transactions consistent with everyday travel expenses. There was no indication of large or unusual withdrawals during the early weeks overseas, and no confirmed activity that would suggest financial instability or sudden change of circumstances. Immigration and travel documentation confirmed that Marion moved through standard border processes during this period. There is no public record of any travel restriction, alert, or administrative concern being raised in relation to her movements. What is important in this stage of the timeline is the consistency between official records and personal communication. Marion's location, her messages to family, and her financial activity align with one another. Together, they form a clear picture of a person traveling independently and according to plan. Investigators later emphasized that this early phase of Marion's journey is one of the least uncertain parts of the case. There is no dispute that she left Australia voluntarily. There is no dispute that she arrived overseas and began traveling. And there is no dispute that she remained in contact during the first part of her time away. This period also confirms something equally important. Marion did not immediately disappear after leaving home. There was no sudden break in contact, and no unexplained gap at the start of her trip. Instead, her absence developed gradually, only later becoming a cause for concern. Authorities have also stated that there was no evidence, during this early travel period, of anyone accompanying Marion in a way that would suggest she was under another person's control. She was traveling alone, making her own arrangements, and maintaining independent contact with family. The records available from this time show no unusual pattern of movement. Her travel followed common routes used by international visitors, and there was no confirmed deviation from what she had described to family before leaving Australia. In later years, when investigators reviewed the case, this early stage was repeatedly used as a baseline for comparison. It demonstrated what Marion's normal communication looked like while traveling, how often she contacted family, and how her financial activity typically appeared during independent travel. In later years, when investigators reviewed the case, this early stage was repeatedly used as a baseline for comparison. It demonstrated what Marion's normal communication looked like while traveling, how often she contacted family, and how her financial activity typically appeared during independent travel. This baseline would become important later, when contact became less frequent and then stopped altogether. For now, however, the early travel records speak quietly and clearly. Marion Barter left Queensland in an organized and deliberate way. She arrived overseas as planned. She communicated with family, and for a time, her journey unfolded exactly as she had said it would. During the first part of Marion Barter's time overseas, contact with her family continued in a way that felt natural and reassuring. This early communication later became one of the most important reference points in the investigation, because it showed clearly how Marion normally stayed in touch while traveling. Family members later confirmed that Marion wrote letters regularly during the early weeks of her journey. These letters were sent through standard postal services and were received in Australia without delay. That would have suggested unusual routing or difficulty. Police later confirmed that the postmarks on the letters matched the locations Marion had described as visiting. The content of the letters has not been released publicly in full. However, authorities have stated that the messages were ordinary in tone and reflected everyday travel experiences. Marion wrote about where she was staying, places she had seen, and general impressions of her journey. There were no references to danger, distress, or unexpected problems. Telephone contact also formed part of Marion's early communication. Family members reported receiving international phone calls during this period. These calls were described as relaxed and conversational, focused on routine updates rather than serious concerns. Police later confirmed that the timing and routing of these calls were consistent with international travel from Europe. What is particularly important in this stage of the case is the consistency of Marion's communication. Letters and phone calls followed a familiar pattern. She did not disappear for extended periods without explanation, and she did not suddenly change the way she communicated with her daughter or close family members. Investigators later used this pattern to establish a baseline for Marion's behavior while traveling. It helped clarify how often she normally contacted home and how she tended to share information about her movements. Family members have stated that Marion did not appear secretive in her correspondence. She shared general details about where she was going and what she planned to do next, even though she did not provide exact daily itineraries. This level of detail was considered typical for personal travel communication at the time. There were also no indications in her letters or calls that she was attempting to distance herself from family. On the contrary, the continued communication suggested that maintaining contact remained important to her. From an investigative perspective, this early communication also confirmed that Marion was capable of managing international travel independently. She was able to arrange accommodation, communicate clearly, and maintain contact without assistance. It is important to separate this confirmed communication from later claims that have circulated publicly. Some reports have suggested that Marion's letters contained hidden messages or coded warnings. Police have not supported these claims. Authorities have stated that no evidence of coded communication was identified in the letters that were examined. Another public claim has suggested that Marion may have been pressured or influenced by someone during this early stage of her travel. Again, police have not confirmed this. There is no verified indication in her correspondence that another person was controlling her movements or restricting her contact. Investigators have also stated that there is no evidence that Marion used alternative identities or false names in her early communication. All known letters and calls were consistent with her known identity and normal communication style. The timing of this early contact is also significant. Letters and calls were spread over a period of weeks rather than days. This supports the conclusion that Marion was actively traveling rather than remaining in a single fixed location. Over time, however, this steady pattern of contact began to change. Family members later explained that communication became less frequent. This shift did not happen suddenly, and at first it did not cause immediate concern. Travel can be busy, and communication can become irregular. Investigators later emphasized that this gradual reduction in contact is one of the most difficult aspects of the case to interpret. A slow change in communication does not, on its own, indicate danger. It only becomes significant when viewed alongside what followed. For now, the early letters and phone calls remain a quiet and important record of Marion's voice during the first part of her journey. They show a woman traveling independently, staying in touch with those at home, and sharing ordinary experiences from a life temporarily lived at a distance. As Marion Barter continued her journey through Europe, the record of her movements becomes narrower and more dependent on formal documentation, rather than personal communication. This stage of the timeline is built from immigration records, accommodation information that could be verified, and the final confirmed points at which Marion can be placed with certainty. Police later confirmed that Marion traveled beyond the United Kingdom and moved through parts of continental Europe. Her early letters and calls supported this, and official travel records showed that she entered and exited countries through normal border systems using her Australian passport. There is no indication that she traveled under an assumed name or used irregular documentation during this period. What can be confirmed is that Marion continued to travel independently. There is no verified record showing that she was registered as part of a tour group or accompanied by a named traveling partner through official booking systems. This does not mean she was always alone, but it does mean that the records available to investigators do not identify another person traveling with her under shared reservations or linked documentation. As her journey progressed, the number of personal communications received by family decreased. This reduction is reflected in the timeline, but it does not coincide with a known emergency, disruption to travel, or recorded incident. From an investigative point of view, this gradual change is important because it does not mark a clear moment when Marion can be said to have disappeared. The last confirmed movements of Marion are established through official systems rather than letters or phone calls. Police have confirmed that her passport was used to enter Europe and that her travel continued in a way consistent with an ordinary tourist itinerary. These entries are considered reliable because they come from border control records rather than personal recollection. Investigators have not publicly released a detailed list of every country Marion passed through. They have stated only that the verified records place her in Europe during the later stages of her trip and confirm that she remained mobile rather than staying in one fixed location. At some point during this period, Marion's contact with her family became irregular and then stopped. Authorities have never identified a specific date on which communication ceased. This is partly because letters can be delayed, and because phone calls during international travel in the 1990s were often infrequent and dependent on access to public or hotel telephones. From a policing perspective, the final confirmed personal contact and the final confirmed official movement do not necessarily align. This creates a gap between when Marion was last heard from by her family and when she was last recorded in formal systems. The most significant, confirmed location associated with Marion during this stage is Europe. Beyond that broad placement, police have avoided releasing precise geographic detail, particularly where it could compromise investigative lines or identify individuals or locations that have already been examined without result. What investigators have been clear about is that there is no confirmed record of Marion returning to Australia. There is no arrival record under her name, and there is no verified evidence that she completed her journey and came home. There is also no confirmed record of Marion reporting herself as unwell, seeking emergency assistance, or contacting Australian diplomatic services during this time. This does not mean that she experienced no difficulty. It simply means that no such contact has been documented. As time passed, family members became increasingly concerned by the lack of communication. However, because Marion was traveling independently and had previously stayed in touch in a flexible and informal way, there was no immediate moment at which her absence could clearly be identified as alarming rather than inconvenient. Investigators later described this period as one of quiet uncertainty. There were no reports from hotels, transport providers, or fellow travelers that pointed to a disturbance or unusual incident involving Marion. There were also no official alerts or border system notifications that would indicate detention, deportation, or travel refusal. Another important confirmed point is that Marion's passport was not recorded as being used to leave Europe through any known exit system under her own name during this stage of the journey. This does not establish that she remained in Europe indefinitely, but it does mean that no formal departure record has been identified that would clearly close the loop on her movements. The absence of a confirmed exit record is one of the elements that has remained unresolved. Border systems in the 1990s were not as comprehensive or interconnected as modern systems, and investigators have acknowledged that gaps in historical travel data are possible. What remains firmly established is limited but precise. Marion left Australia voluntarily. She entered Europe using her own passport. She travelled within Europe for a period of time. She maintained contact early in that journey, and later that contact ended. Beyond these points, there is no confirmed sighting, record, or verified interaction that places Marion at a specific location after the final official movements identified by investigators. This stage of the case is therefore defined less by what is known, and more by the narrowing of reliable information. As personal communication faded and official records became less frequent, Marion's presence within traceable systems gradually became quieter. For investigators, this moment represents the transition from a journey that can be followed to a disappearance that can only be inferred. There is no single incident that marks the change. There is no reported crisis. There is only the slow loss of contact, followed by the absence of any new verified movement that could confirm where Marion went next. In the timeline of her disappearance, Europe remains the final confirmed setting of Marion Barter's travels. Beyond that point, the record becomes silent. The final confirmed contact from Marion Barter did not arrive in the form of an emergency message or a clear indication of danger. Instead, it was consistent in tone with the earlier communication she had maintained while traveling, which made its later significance difficult to recognize at the time. Family members later explained that Marion's last known contact was received during her time in Europe. This contact was part of the same pattern of letters and occasional telephone calls that had defined the earlier weeks of her journey. There was no warning, request for assistance, or suggestion that she was experiencing difficulty. Police have not publicly released the exact wording or full content of this final communication. Authorities have stated only that it did not contain language that would reasonably indicate fear, distress, or immediate concern. From an investigative perspective, this meant there was no clear signal at that moment that something had gone wrong. After this point, communication gradually stopped. There was no single missed call or unanswered letter that clearly marked the beginning of Marion's disappearance. Instead, family members noticed that time passed without further updates. At first, this did not immediately raise alarm. Marion was traveling, and long gaps in contact were not unusual during international trips in the 1990s. As the weeks continued, however, the silence became increasingly difficult to explain. Family members attempted to make contact through the methods they had previously used. Calls were made to numbers Marion had provided earlier in her trip. Letters were sent to addresses she had shared. None of these attempts produced a response. It was during this period that concern began to grow quietly, rather than suddenly. There was no dramatic moment of realization. There was only the steady absence of any reply. For Marion's daughter, this lack of communication was particularly troubling. Their relationship had been defined by regular contact, even while Marion was traveling. The change in pattern stood out not because it was alarming in isolation, but because it was different from what had come before. Police later confirmed that there was no record of Marion contacting Australian authorities, embassies, or consular services during this period. There were also no confirmed reports from accommodation providers or transport services, suggesting that Marion had encountered a serious incident. The difficulty for family members at this stage was knowing how to interpret the silence. Adult travelers can choose to change plans, extend trips, or move without notice. At the same time, Marion had not indicated any intention to cut off communication or to remain away indefinitely. As time passed, concern shifted gradually into uncertainty. Family members were faced with the absence of information rather than the presence of a problem that could be clearly defined. Without a confirmed location or a known point of disruption, it was difficult to determine when the situation had moved beyond ordinary travel silence. Eventually, Marion's continued absence and the lack of any contact prompted her family to seek assistance. They began to raise the possibility that something may have happened to her during her travels, even though there was no specific incident they could point to. This transition from private concern to formal inquiry was shaped by hesitation rather than urgency. It reflected the reality of international travel at the time and the absence of any clear sign of danger. Investigators later acknowledged that this delay in recognizing the seriousness of the situation was understandable. Without a known last sighting, emergency contact, or reported incident, there was little to trigger an immediate response. For the family, however, the growing silence became impossible to ignore. The absence of letters and phone calls created a quiet and persistent uncertainty that would eventually lead to the decision to report Marion as missing. The final contact, when viewed in isolation, does not explain what followed. It does not point toward a specific location, a particular individual, or a defined moment of risk. It stands instead as the last ordinary communication in a journey that slowly and quietly slipped beyond reach. It was from this uncertain and unremarkable ending to contact that the search for answers would eventually begin. When the prolonged silence from Marion Barter could no longer be explained by travel delays or changing plans, her family took the difficult step of reporting her missing. This decision was shaped by the absence of any contact and by the growing recognition that Marion's behavior no longer matched the pattern she had established during the earlier stages of her journey. The missing person report was made in Queensland, where Marion had lived and worked before leaving Australia. Police later confirmed that the report was not made immediately after communication stopped, but only after family members had spent time attempting to reach her through known contact details and addresses. This delay was not treated as unusual. Investigators acknowledged that international travel, especially in the 1990s, often involved long periods without reliable communication. Once the report was received, Queensland police began the initial assessment of the case. At this stage, there was no evidence of criminal activity and no confirmed indication that Marion had come to harm. The investigation therefore began as a standard missing person inquiry, rather than as a criminal investigation. Officers first focused on confirming Marion's identity, travel history, and last known movements. This involved gathering information from family members, reviewing documents Marion had left behind, and collecting details about her planned itinerary and intended return. Police also requested information from federal agencies responsible for immigration and border movement. These records confirmed that Marion had departed Australia using her own passport and that there was no record of her returning to the country. Early inquiries also involved contact with Australian authorities responsible for overseas consular assistance. Police confirmed that there was no record of Marion seeking help through Australian diplomatic services while abroad. At this stage, investigators were faced with a fundamental limitation. Marion was last known to be overseas, and Australian police had no direct jurisdiction to conduct physical searches or interviews outside the country. As a result, early investigative efforts relied heavily on record checks and international requests for information. Police gathered copies of Marion's passport information, travel documentation, and known correspondence. Family members provided letters and contact details that had been exchanged during the early part of her trip. These materials formed the basis of the initial timeline. Investigators also examined Marion's personal affairs in Australia. This included confirming the status of her home, employment, and financial accounts. Police later stated that there was no indication that Marion had made preparations consistent with a permanent disappearance, such as closing accounts, transferring property, or resigning from long-term commitments without explanation. At this early stage, police also considered the possibility that Marion had chosen to remain overseas voluntarily. This is a standard consideration in adult missing person cases, particularly where no evidence of coercion or harm is present. Investigators therefore approached the case cautiously, seeking to confirm facts rather than to assume wrongdoing. International inquiries were initiated through established law enforcement channels. These requests sought confirmation of Marion's movements through immigration systems and any recorded interaction with local authorities overseas. Because of the time that had already passed, and the complexity of international record systems at the time, responses were limited. Police have later acknowledged that the tools available for international tracking and data sharing in the 1990s were far more restricted than they are today. This significantly affected the speed and scope of early inquiries. The initial police response was therefore defined by administrative and procedural work, rather than by visible investigative activity. Officers compiled records, established timelines, and submitted requests for information to multiple agencies. Family members were kept informed of these early steps, although police were also clear that the absence of evidence meant that progress would likely be slow. Investigators could not identify a location at which to focus a physical search, and they had no confirmed incident that could be examined by foreign authorities. Despite these limitations, police treated the report seriously. Marion's prolonged absence, combined with the sudden end of communication, justified continued review of her case. Over time, as early inquiries failed to produce any confirmation of Marion's location or well-being, the case remained open. Investigators continued to monitor immigration records and to follow up any information provided by family members. The early response did not resolve the central uncertainty. It did, however, establish the official foundation of the investigation. Marion Barter was formally recognized as a missing person. Her identity and travel history were recorded, and the process of searching for reliable information about her whereabouts had begun. From this point forward, the case would move slowly and carefully through administrative systems and international channels, shaped by the practical reality that the person being searched for had last been known to be far from home. One of the most significant and carefully examined parts of the investigation into the disappearance of Marion Barter has involved financial records and official identity systems. Unlike personal communication, which can fade naturally during travel, financial and administrative activity leaves structured and time-stamped traces that can be reviewed long after a person is no longer in contact. Queensland police confirmed that Marion's bank accounts in Australia remained active after her departure from the country. For a period of time following the last known contact with her family, transactions continued to appear on her accounts. These transactions became one of the clearest indicators that activity linked to her identity had not immediately stopped when communication ended. Investigators later confirmed that withdrawals and purchases were recorded through Marion's Australian bank cards. The pattern of this activity differed from the way she had used her accounts before leaving Australia, while her earlier travel spending reflected ordinary tourist behavior. Later transactions appeared in locations that could not be easily connected to the travel plans she had discussed with family. Police have stated that this financial activity became central to the investigation, not because it proved who was using the accounts, but because it demonstrated that Marion's identity continued to be operational within banking systems after her disappearance. Importantly, authorities have never publicly confirmed that Marion herself carried out these later transactions. The records show only that her cards and account details were used. A bank transaction can confirm location and time, but it cannot confirm the identity of the person physically making the withdrawal or purchase. This distinction has remained central to how police have interpreted the financial evidence. Investigators also examined the nature of the transactions themselves. The amounts withdrawn and the frequency of use were documented in detail. While the activity did not suggest large or sudden attempts to empty accounts, it did show ongoing use over time rather than a single isolated incident. Police later stated that this pattern was inconsistent with accidental or one-off misuse. The accounts were accessed repeatedly. At the same time, there were no confirmed communications from Marion explaining these transactions. There were no letters, phone calls, or messages that connected the later financial activity to her personal travel. In addition to banking records, investigators examined identity documentation associated with Marion. This included her passport and official government identity systems that record changes to personal information. Authorities confirmed that Marion's Australian passport had been valid at the time of her departure, and that it had been used to exit Australia. However, one of the most significant identity findings came later, when investigators discovered that an application had been made to replace her passport. This replacement passport application was processed after Marion's disappearance. Police have confirmed that the application was submitted under Marion's name and personal details. The process followed official procedures, meaning that the application passed administrative checks at the time. However, investigators have not publicly confirmed who physically submitted the application. From a legal and investigative standpoint, this created a highly unusual situation. A person who had not been seen or heard from by family for an extended period was now associated with formal identity documentation being updated and reissued. The existence of the replacement passport became one of the most complex elements of the case. Authorities have confirmed that the replacement passport was later used for international travel. This established that someone, using Marion's identity, was able to move through border systems after her disappearance. Once again, however, the records could not confirm whether Marion herself was present during those movements. Investigators have been careful to avoid stating that Marion traveled after her disappearance. Instead, they have consistently stated that her identity was used. This difference in language reflects the limits of the evidence. The combination of ongoing financial activity and passport use created a parallel record of movement that existed alongside the complete absence of personal contact. In practical terms, this meant that two separate timelines emerged. One was the human timeline, defined by letters, phone calls, and family knowledge, which ended quietly. The other was an administrative timeline, defined by systems that continued to record activity in Marion's name. Police also reviewed whether Marion had authorized any third party to access her finances or documents before leaving Australia. No confirmed evidence has been released indicating that she had formally granted such authority. There were no publicly confirmed power of attorney arrangements, financial delegations, or written permissions that would easily explain ongoing account use. Investigators also examined whether Marion's identity had been compromised through fraud or theft. While the later activity could be consistent with identity misuse, police have not publicly confirmed a specific method through which her personal details may have been obtained. It is also important to separate confirmed facts from later public interpretation. Some media reporting and online commentary has suggested that the financial and passport activity proves that Marion deliberately chose to disappear and live under controlled or hidden circumstances. Police have not confirmed this. The existence of administrative activity does not establish personal intent or personal involvement. Authorities have repeatedly emphasized that financial and identity systems are designed to verify documents, not people. If valid documentation is presented and required procedures appear to be followed, systems may record legitimate activity, even when the true identity of the individual involved cannot be independently confirmed. Another important point confirmed by police is that there is no verified evidence that Marion accessed her own bank accounts in person after her disappearance. There is also no confirmed sighting or identification of her linked to any of the later transactions. The financial trail, while unusually extensive for a missing person case, therefore remains incomplete. It provides location data and timing information, but not confirmation of identity. Investigators also reviewed whether Marion's financial activity eventually stopped. Police have stated that the use of her accounts did not continue indefinitely. At some point, the activity ceased. However, authorities have not publicly confirmed the precise date of the final transaction, nor the circumstances under which account access ended. The same limitation applies to identity documentation. While the replacement passport and its use were confirmed, there is no public record establishing what ultimately happened to that document. Over time, the financial and identity evidence became one of the strongest indicators that Marion's disappearance could not be treated as a simple loss of contact during travel. It introduced the possibility that her personal information continued to be used independently of her direct involvement. At the same time, police have remained cautious not to draw conclusions that cannot be supported. The evidence does not prove that Marion was being controlled by another person. It does not prove that she willingly handed over her documents, and it does not prove that she was no longer alive at the time the records were created. What it does confirm is far narrower, but firmly established. Marion Barter's identity remained active within financial and government systems after she could no longer be contacted by her family. Her bank accounts were used, her passport was replaced, and travel occurred in her name. For investigators, these records represent one of the most unusual and difficult aspects of the case. They provide measurable data without human confirmation, and they extend the official footprint of Marion's identity beyond the point at which her personal presence can be verified. In a disappearance already defined by distance and silence, the continued movement of her identity through formal systems has remained one of the clearest reminders that a name can continue to exist long after a person can no longer be found. After the unusual financial and identity activity connected to Marion's name was identified, investigators began a more focused review of passport records, international travel systems, and the limits of what those systems could reliably confirm. This stage of the investigation did not rely on personal recollection or witness memory. It relied almost entirely on administrative records created when identity documents are processed and when travelers move through border control. Police confirmed that a replacement Australian passport was issued in Marion's name after her family had lost contact with her. The application used her correct personal details and was accepted through normal administrative procedures. At the time, there was no automatic system capable of identifying whether the person presenting the application was genuinely the original passport holder or someone using valid documentation in another way. Authorities have stated that the issuance of the replacement passport does not confirm who physically attended the application process. It confirms only that an application was accepted and processed under Marion's identity. Once the replacement passport was issued, international travel records later showed that the document was used. Border systems recorded movements made using that passport. These records became one of the most significant indicators that Marion's identity continued to move through official systems after her disappearance. At the same time, investigators have been careful to clarify a crucial limitation. Border records confirm the use of a document, not the confirmed identity of the person holding it. At the time these records were created, biometric verification was not widely implemented in international travel systems. Identity checks relied largely on the physical document itself and basic visual comparison. This meant that authorities could not confirm whether Marion herself was present at any of the border crossings associated with the replacement passport. The systems could only confirm that her identity was being used. Because of this, police have avoided using language that suggests Marion traveled after she disappeared. Instead, they have consistently described the records as showing travel in her name. To better understand these movements, Australian authorities made formal inquiries through international law enforcement and border agencies. These requests sought confirmation of the recorded entries and exits linked to the passport and asked whether any additional supporting documentation had been retained by overseas authorities. The responses confirmed the existence of the travel records, but they did not provide identifying information about the individual who physically used the passport. In most cases, no photographs or retained copies of documents were available to allow retrospective identification. Investigators have also explained that, during the 1990s, international travel databases were not integrated across countries in the way they are today. Records were often held separately by each nation, and data sharing depended on manual requests rather than automated systems. This significantly limited the ability to reconstruct a complete and continuous travel route. Another difficulty involved the time that had passed before these inquiries were made. By the time Marion was formally reported missing and international requests were initiated, some systems no longer retained detailed records beyond basic entry and exit data. This reduced the amount of recoverable information. Police also examined whether Marion's passport had ever been flagged as lost, stolen, or cancelled before the replacement was issued. Authorities have stated that there was no record of such a report being made by Marion prior to the replacement application. This meant there was no formal alert within passport systems that would have triggered additional scrutiny at the time. Alongside passport inquiries, investigators reviewed immigration data to confirm whether there was any record of Marion re-entering Australia. Authorities have consistently confirmed that no arrival record under her name has been identified. This absence of a confirmed return does not establish that she remained overseas indefinitely. It confirms only that no entry into Australia under her identity has been recorded through official systems. This absence of a confirmed return does not establish that she remained overseas indefinitely. It confirms only that no entry into Australia under her identity has been recorded through official systems. International inquiries were also extended to determine whether Marion had sought assistance from Australian embassies or consular services abroad. Police confirmed that no such contact was recorded. There was no request for emergency documentation, no report of lost travel papers, and no official welfare inquiry made in her name. Taken together, these findings created a narrow but persistent picture. Marion's identity was active within international travel systems after she was no longer in contact with her family. However, those systems were not designed to confirm the person behind the document. This created one of the most difficult boundaries in the investigation. Authorities could trace where the passport had been used, but they could not determine who was holding it. Over time, police acknowledged that international inquiries had reached their practical limits. Without an identified suspect, without retained biometric data, and without a confirmed sighting linked to the travel records, further progress through passport and border systems alone became unlikely. The travel systems had done what they were designed to do. They recorded movement. They did not record identity in a way that could later be verified. For investigators, this meant that the international footprint of Marion's name could be mapped only partially. It showed activity beyond the point of personal contact. It confirmed that her identity continued to exist in official systems, but it could not bridge the gap between a document and a person. And it is within that gap that one of the central uncertainties of Marion Barter's disappearance continues to remain. As the investigation into the disappearance of Marion Barter developed, police were careful in how they defined and communicated the concept of a person of interest. In this case, the term was not used to describe a suspect in a criminal sense. It was used to describe individuals whose connection to Marion, or to the activity linked to her identity, required closer examination. From the outset, investigators made it clear that the absence of confirmed criminal evidence meant the inquiry had to remain broad. The early direction of the investigation focused on understanding who may have had legitimate or indirect contact with Marion during her travels, and who may have been connected to the later financial and identity activity recorded in her name. One of the first areas examined involved people known to Marion before she left Australia. Police reviewed her personal and professional relationships, including family, former partners, friends, and colleagues. These inquiries were conducted to establish whether anyone had knowledge of her travel plans beyond what was already known to her family, or whether anyone may have had access to her personal documents or financial information. Authorities have stated publicly that these background inquiries did not identify any confirmed conflict, threat, or personal dispute that could clearly explain her disappearance. No individual within Marion's known personal circle has been charged or formally accused in relation to her case. Investigators also reviewed whether Marion had formed new personal connections during her travels. This line of inquiry focused on identifying whether she may have met people who later became involved in her accommodation, financial arrangements, or identity documentation. It is important to distinguish between confirmed investigative steps and public speculation. Police have confirmed that they explored the possibility that Marion had interacted with other travelers, acquaintances, or associates while overseas. However, authorities have not publicly identified any named individual as being directly linked to her disappearance. Another major investigative direction emerged from the later use of Marion's bank accounts and the replacement of her passport, because these activities occurred after she could no longer be contacted. Police examined who may have had access to her personal information, identity documents, or financial details. This included reviewing whether anyone may have had possession of her passport, bank cards, or supporting documents. Authorities have confirmed that this line of inquiry remains one of the most significant in the case. However, they have also stated that the records available do not identify a specific person who can be linked to the transactions or to the passport application. The investigative focus therefore shifted toward understanding opportunity rather than identity. Police assessed who could reasonably have obtained Marion's personal details, and how those details could have been used within administrative systems. Another investigative direction involved determining whether Marion herself may have authorized or participated in any of the later activity. Police have been careful in their language on this point. They have stated only that the available evidence does not allow investigators to confirm whether Marion was personally present when her identity was used. This distinction is critical. It means that investigators cannot rule out the possibility of voluntary involvement, and they cannot confirm it. For this reason, police have consistently avoided describing Marion as having deliberately disappeared. They have also avoided describing the case as one of confirmed identity fraud committed by a known individual. Instead, the investigative direction has remained focused on clarifying what can be supported by records rather than on building a narrative of intent. Over time, investigators also considered whether the identity activity connected to Marion's name could be linked to organized or systematic misuse of personal documents. This line of inquiry examined whether similar cases existed within administrative systems and whether known methods of document misuse could explain how a replacement passport was issued and used. Authorities have not publicly confirmed that Marion's case was linked to any broader pattern of identity misuse. Another part of the investigation involved reviewing who may have assisted Marion with accommodation or administrative processes during her time in Europe. Because hotel and short-term accommodation records from the 1990s are limited and often no longer retained, this line of inquiry faced practical constraints. Police have acknowledged that the passage of time significantly affected their ability to identify potential witnesses connected to Marion's later movements. Investigators have also reviewed information provided through public tip lines and media appeals. Over the years, members of the public have submitted claims regarding possible sightings, personal encounters, and indirect knowledge of Marion. Police have stated that these claims were assessed carefully, but none were verified through independent evidence. It is important to separate confirmed investigative outcomes from public narratives that have developed around the case. Various media reports and online discussions have suggested that specific individuals must have been involved, or that Marion's disappearance can be explained through a single relationship or event. Police have not confirmed any such conclusion. The official investigative position remains that no individual has been formally identified as being responsible for Marion's disappearance or for the later use of her identity. As the case progressed, the investigative direction gradually narrowed toward two parallel questions. The first was whether Marion herself was still alive at the time her identity was being used, and whether she had any direct involvement in that activity. The second was whether another person had gained access to her personal information and documents and had used them without her knowledge. At present, neither of these possibilities can be confirmed through available evidence. This has left investigators with a constrained but persistent investigative framework. They continue to focus on verifiable systems, including financial records, passport documentation, and international travel data, rather than on unverified personal claims. In public statements, police have repeatedly emphasized that the case does not currently support the identification of a suspect. There is no individual against whom sufficient evidence exists to justify formal criminal proceedings. For Marion Barter's investigation, the concept of a person of interest remains procedural rather than accusatory. It reflects the need to examine connections and opportunities, not the presence of confirmed wrongdoing. The direction of the inquiry has therefore remained careful, restrained, and evidence-led. It follows what can be traced within official systems, and it avoids drawing conclusions about individuals where no reliable link can be established. In a case defined by administrative activity without personal confirmation, investigative direction continues to be guided by records rather than relationships. As the disappearance of Marion Barter became more widely known, public discussion and media coverage gradually began to shape parallel narratives alongside the official investigation. Over time, these narratives developed into a mixture of interpretation, personal opinion, and unverified claims, often filling the long periods in which police were unable to release new information. Australian authorities have consistently drawn a clear boundary between what has been confirmed through investigation and what has emerged through public commentary. Police statements have remained focused on records, documentation, and verifiable activity, while media reporting has often attempted to interpret meaning, motive, and personal intention. One of the most common public claims has centered on the belief that Marion deliberately chose to disappear and live under a different identity. This interpretation is often linked to the continued financial and passport activity recorded in her name. Police have not supported this conclusion. Authorities have stated that administrative systems can confirm only that a document or account was used, not who physically used it or why. Another widely repeated narrative suggests that the replacement passport could only have been obtained if Marion herself was present. Police have clarified that this is not necessarily the case, particularly in the administrative context of the 1990s. At that time, identity verification relied primarily on documentation and visual checks rather than biometric confirmation. Public discussion has also frequently suggested that the pattern of financial activity reflects careful planning or deliberate long-term arrangements. Police have avoided such interpretation. Investigators have stated only that the transactions demonstrate repeated use of bank accounts linked to Marion's identity. They do not demonstrate intent, planning, or personal control. Another claim often raised in media coverage involves the possibility that Marion formed a close relationship during her travels and chose to remain overseas. Police have confirmed that they examined whether Marion had formed new personal connections. However, no verified evidence has been released that links any identified individual to her disappearance or to the later identity activity. Some public narratives have also suggested that Marion may have been involved in a lifestyle or personal movement that encouraged separation from family or previous life. Police have not confirmed any such involvement, and they have stated that no evidence supports this theory. There have also been repeated claims that police are withholding crucial information that would allow the public to solve the case. Authorities have addressed this carefully, explaining that releasing incomplete or sensitive material could compromise future investigative opportunities and could expose private individuals to harm or misidentification. Another persistent narrative concerns the timing of Marion's disappearance. Public discussion often attempts to identify a precise date on which something must have happened to her. Police have been clear that no single confirmed moment of disappearance exists in the record. The case is defined by a gradual loss of contact rather than a single documented incident. In some reporting, the continued use of Marion's identity has been portrayed as proof of organized identity fraud. While police have examined whether systematic misuse of documents could explain the case, they have not confirmed any link between Marion's disappearance and a broader criminal network. Authorities have also addressed claims that the case has been neglected or allowed to fade. Police have stated that the investigation remains open and has been subject to periodic review. However, they have also acknowledged that unresolved cases often proceed quietly, without public updates, particularly when no new evidence has emerged. A further source of misunderstanding has involved the distinction between police language and media terminology. Terms such as suspect, offender, and person of interest are frequently used interchangeably in public reporting. Police have been careful to avoid this. They have stated that no individual has been formally identified as a suspect in Marion's disappearance. In contrast to public narratives, police statements have remained deliberately limited. They have focused on what can be confirmed through records and lawful inquiries. They have avoided presenting theories about motive, personality, or personal choice. This difference in approach has created two versions of the case in the public sphere. One is shaped by evidence and legal standards. The other is shaped by interpretation and the understandable desire to explain a long and unresolved absence. For investigators, the priority has remained the same. Only information that can be independently verified can guide the inquiry. Everything else, regardless of how widely it is discussed, remains unproven. In the disappearance of Marion Barter, the distance between public narrative and official position remains wide. The case continues to be defined not by what has been imagined, but by what can be demonstrated. As the years passed after the disappearance of Marion Barter, the investigation gradually moved from an active missing person inquiry into a long-term review process. This shift did not reflect a loss of concern, but rather a change in how police were able to work with the information that existed. Without a confirmed location, a known witness, or a verified incident overseas, progress depended almost entirely on records and later reassessment. Queensland police have confirmed that Marion's case remained open and active within their systems. It was not closed or suspended, and it continued to be reviewed as new information. Improved technology and additional records became available. Investigators periodically returned to the original file to confirm that early inquiries had been completed correctly and that no procedural opportunities had been missed. One of the most important features of these later reviews was the re-examination of financial and identity records. As banking systems improved and digital records became easier to analyze, police were able to recheck transaction data and confirm timelines with greater precision than had been possible during the initial investigation. These reviews reinforced the earlier finding that activity linked to Marion's identity continued after contact with her family had ended. But they did not reveal the identity of the person responsible for that activity. Passport and travel data were also reviewed as international systems developed. Authorities sought updated confirmation of entry and exit records and attempted to clarify whether any additional information had become available through improved data sharing arrangements. However, because much of Marion's travel took place during the 1990s, the amount of information stored by foreign border agencies remained limited. Later reviews confirmed that the same restrictions continued to apply. Investigators also returned to the original correspondence and documentation provided by Marion's family. Letters, contact details, and travel notes were re-examined to confirm timelines and to ensure that no information had been misunderstood or incorrectly recorded during the early stages of the investigation. These reviews did not reveal new locations or contacts that could be independently verified. Over time, police also assessed whether changes in legislation or investigative practice could assist the case. In particular, they reviewed whether new identity verification procedures or data matching systems could help determine how Marion's passport had been replaced and subsequently used. While these reviews clarified administrative processes, they did not establish who physically made use of Marion's identity. Another significant development in the life of the case came through formal public and legal review processes in Australia. Marion's disappearance became the subject of renewed attention, and the handling of the investigation itself was examined. These reviews focused on whether appropriate steps had been taken by authorities, whether communication with the family had been adequate, and whether any opportunities for further investigation had been overlooked. As part of this process, police were required to provide detailed records of their inquiries, decisions, and communications. This allowed external reviewers to assess the structure of the investigation rather than its outcome. Authorities have stated that these reviews did not identify misconduct or deliberate failure, but they did highlight the severe limitations created by the absence of direct evidence and the challenges of international investigation at the time. The reviews also confirmed that Marion's case remained unusual because of the volume and duration of identity-linked activity following her disappearance. This feature continued to distinguish the case from many other long-term missing person investigations, where administrative records usually fall silent shortly after contact ends. Despite renewed attention, no new confirmed witness emerged. No verified sighting could be established, and no individual could be linked to Marion through independent evidence. Information received from the public was reviewed and assessed, but none of it could be substantiated through records or supporting material. Police have stated that the continued review of the case is focused on two practical priorities. The first is the preservation of all material connected to Marion's identity, including financial and passport documentation, so that future systems can be used if further data becomes accessible. The second is the continued monitoring of relevant databases in case new matches, links, or records become available. Investigators have also acknowledged that time itself presents one of the greatest obstacles. As years pass, institutional records are archived or destroyed according to retention policies, and personal memories become less reliable. People who may once have encountered Marion during her travels may no longer remember details clearly, and some may no longer be reachable. This does not mean that the case has been abandoned. It means that its progress is no longer driven by active field investigation, but by careful review, preservation of evidence, and readiness to respond if new verified information appears. For Marion's family, the long review process has represented a different kind of uncertainty. Unlike cases where a clear event marks a disappearance, Marion's absence is defined by gradual silence and by administrative activity that continued without human confirmation. Reviews can confirm what has already been established, but they cannot provide answers where no connecting evidence exists. Authorities have stated that the case remains open and that it continues to be treated as unresolved. It has not been reclassified, and no formal conclusion has been issued regarding what ultimately happened to Marion. The long passage of time has not reduced the importance of the case within the police system. Instead, it has changed the way the investigation is maintained. Marion Barter's disappearance now exists within a framework of ongoing review, preserved records, and procedural readiness. It remains a case shaped not by what has been discovered, but by what has not yet been connected. More than 2 decades after Marion Barter was last heard from, the investigation remains open and unresolved. This is not because the case lacks documentation, but because the information that exists has never been able to connect a person, a location, and a moment into a single confirmed explanation. One of the most significant challenges has been the absence of a clearly defined point at which Marion can be said to have disappeared. There is no confirmed final sighting, no recorded emergency, and no verified incident linked to her last communication. Instead, the case is shaped by a gradual loss of contact that does not produce a specific starting point for a search. This uncertainty has limited every stage of the investigation, without a confirmed location for Marion's last movements. Police have not been able to focus inquiries on a particular city, country, or community. International requests for information must rely on broad searches rather than targeted investigation. Another major limitation lies in the nature of the financial and identity evidence. While records show that Marion's bank accounts and passport were used after she could no longer be contacted, those systems were never designed to verify the identity of the person using them. They confirm activity, but not the presence of Marion herself. This creates a situation in which two parallel records exist. One reflects a person who stopped communicating. The other reflects an identity that continued to operate within administrative systems, without a way to link those 2 records to the same individual. Investigators are unable to determine whether Marion was personally involved in that activity, or whether someone else was using her identity. The investigation has also been limited by the international nature of the case. Marion was last known to be overseas, and most of the relevant systems and potential witnesses are located outside Australia. During the 1990s, international data sharing and record retention were far more restricted than they are today. As a result, many potentially useful records no longer exist, or were never created in a form that could be reviewed later. The absence of verified witnesses has also played a significant role. No one has come forward who can confirm seeing Marion after her final known communications. No accommodation provider, transport worker, or fellow traveller has been able to provide independent confirmation of her presence. During the later stages of her journey, another important limitation involves the lack of a confirmed motive. Police have found no evidence of financial crisis, personal conflict, or legal difficulty that would clearly explain why Marion may have chosen to disappear. At the same time, there is no confirmed evidence that she was harmed or coerced by another person. This absence of motive makes it difficult to prioritize investigative directions. Without a clear reason for disappearance, police have had to examine many possible explanations without the guidance of a defining event or relationship. Time itself has become one of the greatest obstacles. As years pass, records are archived or destroyed, businesses close, and individuals move or become unreachable. Even when information is located, it is often no longer possible to verify it through independent sources. Authorities have continued to review Marion's case and to preserve the records that remain. Financial and passport data have been retained. Official documentation has been reviewed repeatedly. International inquiries have been made within legal and practical limits. Despite this sustained effort, no single piece of new evidence has been able to bridge the central gap in the case. There is no confirmed sighting to establish Marion's presence after her final contact. There is no verified identity attached to the later financial and passport activity. There is no incident that can be examined as the moment her disappearance began. The case remains unresolved because the available evidence cannot be connected in a way that meets investigative or legal standards. For investigators, this means the work continues quietly rather than visibly. The case remains open. The records remain preserved, and the possibility of future identification remains dependent on a single new connection, whether through improved international data, a newly discovered record, or a credible witness, until such a connection can be made. The disappearance of Marion Barter remains defined not by what is unknown, but by what cannot yet be proven. As night settles quietly across Queensland, the places that once formed the ordinary shape of Marion's life remain unchanged. School buildings stand silent behind locked gates. Empty classrooms wait for the morning light. Residential streets grow still as neighbors turn off their lamps and close their doors. The disappearance of Marion Barter does not carry the sharp edges of a single moment. There is no confirmed scene, no defined location where everything changed. Instead, there is distance, there is time, and there is a gradual silence that slowly replaced a familiar voice. In cases like this, the records can speak more clearly than memory. Travel systems can record movement. Financial systems can record activity. Administrative files can show that a name continued to exist inside formal structures long after contact with family had ended. But none of those systems can tell us who stood behind the documents, who held the card, or who crossed the border. For investigators, this creates a form of uncertainty that does not fade with effort. Every review confirms the same boundaries. The evidence remains carefully preserved. The files remain open. The possibility of future identification still exists, but connection has not yet been achieved. For Marion's family, the absence has not followed the natural shape of loss. There is no moment to return to, no clear place where answers might one day be found. There is only a long, quiet space where ordinary contact once existed, and yet life continues around the absence. Children walk to school along the same streets where Marion once lived. Neighbors continue their routines. The seasons pass without reference to a story that remains unresolved. There is something quietly difficult about a disappearance that leaves no visible trace, no landmark, no memorial, no defined edge between before and after. It remains suspended in time, held only by documentation and by the people who continue to carry the questions. Tonight, there is no conclusion to offer, only a gentle recognition that a woman once prepared carefully for a journey, stayed in touch with those she loved, and then slowly moved beyond every system that could confirm her presence. As the evening deepens and the world becomes softer around you, you do not need to search for an ending where none yet exists. It is enough to allow this story to rest quietly, held within the stillness of an unanswered night. And for now, in the quiet hours, the name of Marion Barter remains where it has remained for many years. Present in record, absent in certainty.